Hello and warm greetings. Welcome to the Analyst by Vajiram and Ravi, where we would try to comprehensively analyze 7 articles in 2 different sections along with the daily mains answer writing program. In the analysis part, we'll first have a comprehensive discussion with respect to incorporating energy sovereignty in India's overall energy policy framework in the light of its overdependence on the imports with respect to the crude oil and natural gas. Then in the second article, we'll have a discussion with respect to the importance of women in the STEM domain, the challenges and the way forward. Then in the simplified section, we'll have a look at 5 different articles from a special perspective of UPSC Prelims 2026 along with the value addition. So stay tuned. Coming to the very first topic of today's discussion, this is energy sovereignty is the new oil. Can a nation truly call itself independent if it is dependent upon the other countries for its most basic need, that is energy? See, what you have to understand is that India's growth story is deeply intertwined. It's deeply tied with the energy aspect. Yet, even today, we are dependent upon the imports for most of the commodities. Specifically, here we are talking about the crude oil and natural gas. This over-dependence of India makes us vulnerable on 3 important factors. The very first is the global price shocks with respect to the crude oil or the natural gas. Second is the supply chain disruptions. And third is with respect to the geopolitical tensions. Therefore, at this particular moment, what is really very important is that we incorporate in our energy framework this particular aspect of energy sovereignty. See, we most often talk about this concept of energy security. But what you have to understand is energy security is relatively a narrow aspect, which only deals with the availability and the affordability of that particular resource. Here we are talking about the crude oil and natural gas. But when we talk about energy sovereignty, it's a more broad concept, which basically includes energy sovereignty within its own ambit. It primarily talks about 3 things, very, very important. First, to increase the domestic capacity of the energy sources. Second, to basically have a more diversified technological base with respect to the energy. And third, to make the systems resilient with respect to the shocks. So here, the concept of energy sovereignty is very, very important. Again, this topic is very important from the perspective of GS3 mobilization of sources and the energy security. There can be a probable question in the means. So we'll try to comprehensively look at what this particular concept is all about. What is the difference between energy security and energy sovereignty? What are the strategic concerns with respect to India? And what should be the way forward? It's a brilliant article which has been featured in the Hindu. Now, if I were to go with the definition of energy sovereignty, it is the right and ability of a nation to decide its own energy sources, policies and technologies in a manner that ensures secure, affordable, sustainable energy for its people without excessive dependence on external actors or geopolitical vulnerabilities. Now, see, this is not a universally accepted definition, but European Union in many of its energy papers has used this particular definition. Also, as Prime Minister Modi often talks about Atmanirbhar Urja, right? So that is a kind of definition which you have to understand. Now, if, as I told you initially, that energy security is one of the integral components of energy sovereignty. How? See, when we talk about the right and ability of a nation, right? Right and ability of a nation, what does it implies? It talks about the autonomy. It talks about the autonomy of that particular nation. Then we have to decide its own energy sources, policies and technologies. Now, what does it mean? It talks about the entire supply chain of the energy, right? Next aspect is in a manner that ensures the secure, affordable and sustainable energy. This is the particular aspect of energy security. Whenever we talk about energy security, these 3 things are important. Secure, affordable, sustainable transfer of the energy, right? Provision of the energy for its people without excessive dependence on external actors or geopolitical vulnerabilities. This aspect talks about the resilience. Right? So that is something which you have to understand, right? It's a more broad concept. You can also have a look, uninterrupted availability of energy sources at affordable price. And this is energy sovereignty, which is the right and ability to determine own energy sources, policies and technologies. So if you were to have the differences between energy security and energy sovereignty, we have this particular table. We have the definition given by the International Energy Agency, which says uninterrupted availability of energy sources at affordable price. That is what we're talking about, the energy security. Here we have this particular definition which I have already told you. Then the focus of the energy security is primarily upon the supply stability, affordability and sustainability. Whereas the focus of energy sovereignty is on autonomy, self-reliance, ownership and local control. That is what you have to understand. What are the key drivers? See, markets, international trade and geopolitical stability. These are the key drivers with respect to energy security. Whereas when we talk about the energy sovereignty aspect, what are the key drivers? We have the indigenous rights, community control, national self-reliance. In Indian context, what we say as Atmanirbhar Bharat. Now, we have this also particular aspect which talks about the scope. When we talk about the scope, see, energy security can be applied at the national level and it can also be applied at the global level, right? So both constructs are there, concerned with reliable imports and diversified sources. When we talk about the energy sovereignty, it's a more inward looking aspect. See, what you have to understand is that we are slowly incorporating the realism aspect in the foreign policy, right? What we call as the strategic autonomy. So strategic autonomy has to also be applied in the energy domain. When you apply strategic autonomy in the energy domain, what you evolve is the energy sovereignty, right? Emphasizes on independence from external actors and local decision making. Then example, you can just have, we are diversifying the sources of the oil, maybe from Middle East, then we have Russia, we have other sources. Here in the energy sovereignty, we are focusing upon the Atmanirbhar Bharat, right? Where we are trying to have our own supply, the production, making up the whole supply chains more resilient, increasing the domestic capacity, making sure that there is integration of technology in the overall supply chain, right? Primary question with respect to energy security is, can we access energy reliably and cheaply? And the question in the energy sovereignty is, do we control the means of production and deciding our energy future? So it's a more broad concept. That's the reason I try to elaborate upon it. Now, when we look at the energy security definition by the International Energy Agency, I've already told you, it is the uninterrupted availability of energy sources at affordable prices. Primarily, there are four factors on which the energy security depends. The very first is availability, that is reliable supply of that particular energy. Then we have accessibility, which is geographic and political ease of procurement of that particular energy supply. Then we have affordability, stable and reasonable costs. Then we have acceptability. Now, when we look at India's energy profile, as I told you, especially after the LPG reforms, what we saw was booming in the economic growth rates. And one of the very important feedback causes was the energy part. That is, we consumed a lot of energy and that was basically responsible for the growth in diversified sectors. And right now what you have to understand is that we are the third largest energy consumer in the world after US and China. When we talk about the primary energy mix usage in the country, just have a look. More than 53% is still dependent upon the coal, right? Then we have oil, 29%. Here we are talking about the primary energy mix. That is what you have to understand. Then we have the renewables, just 10%, right? Then we have the natural gas, 6%. And then we have nuclear at a very meager, which is 2%, very small. Now, when we talk about the import dependence of India on these commodities, when we look at the oil, we are more than 85% dependent on the imports. Can you just imagine? It is a strategic concern for India, right? Then for gas, we are mostly almost 50% dependent. For coal, we are almost 20% dependent, right? Now, what you have to understand is, in this particular editorial, the author is trying to give us the real picture. He's trying to tell us that at this particular juncture, at this particular point of time, we are critically dependent upon the imports of crude oil and natural gas. And this is a very serious strategic threat for the country. He also gives the number. He says that India imports more than 85% of its crude oil and 50% of its natural gas. And what he also says is that this over-dependence, it's not just a very small vulnerability. It's a strategic vulnerability. What does it mean? That it also affects the overall national security framework, because energy security is an integral component of national security framework. That is what you have to understand. Then he gives various reasons. What he says is that there are a lot of global conflicts which we are basically witnessing around the world. Let's take the case of Middle East. We already know what is happening between Israel and Palestine, or the recent conflict which took place between Israel and Iran. Now, this obviously affects the stability in the region. and it obviously affects the supply chains. And once you have these fragmented supply chains or the disruptions in the supply chains, it obviously increases the price of these commodities. And when we are a country who are import dependent on these commodities, definitely we have to bear the brunt of it. That is what the author is talking about, because of the fragile supply chains and the volatile sea lines of communications. You must have seen what happened in the Persian Gulf region, right? Once we had this particular conflict between Israel and Iran, once it was going on, we had Iranian military. It was basically attacking the ships, the commercial vessels of the America and its allies. Or let's talk about what Houthi rebels are doing with respect to the commercial ships in the Red Sea corridor. So once you have, see, these are the regions, the countries in the Middle East. They have reserves of too much of oil sources. And we are critically dependent. Previously, we used to import almost 60% of our supplies. Right now, we have reduced that dependency, almost 45%. But still, 45% is also a big amount. So what you have to understand is whenever a conflict takes place in this particular region, the supply chains are fragmented, they are disrupted. And ultimately, it leads to the increase in the prices of these commodities, the oil prices. Once the oil price increases, definitely it affects or it widens or deepens the trade deficit of India, right? Therefore, it has different repercussions, not only on the security aspect, but also on the overall economy also, right? Then what the author says is that in the year 2024-25, Russia became the largest oil supplier of India. See, what he says is that slowly we have tried to diversify the supply chains, right? See, after the Ukraine war, Russia-Ukraine war started, when we are talking about just before this particular war started, India just used to import almost 2% of its supplies, crude oil supplies from Russia. Now this particular amount has risen to almost 35 to 40%. Primarily because we are getting fair terms of trade with respect to the oil supplies from Russia. But again, what the author is saying is that we cannot be dependent upon a particular player, a particular geopolitical entity. See, definitely Russia has in the past been a very reliable partner for India. But what he is trying to say is that we cannot just look for substitutes. We have to become independent, right, with respect to the energy policy framework. Heavy reliance on one partner increases the risk. Let's say something happens, a war breaks out between the West and the Russia. This would again, right now we are dependent upon 35 to 40% of the imports. What would happen to these supply chains? They would be at risk, right? Therefore, what is really needed is for more diversification. We need to go for more diversified supply chains and not just substitution. That is what you have to understand. Look at this. India's crude oil import sources in 2024, Russia 36%, then we have Iraq, we have Saudi Arabia, UAE. That is what you have to understand. Then the next aspect is with respect to the economic burden of imports. See, the author gives us a very good data. What he says is that in the financial year 2023-24, the crude oil and natural gas import, it took a toll of almost $170 billion. Total merchandise trade of India was almost around $677 billion. And out of this, almost more than 25% was basically used for the imports of crude oil and natural gas. Can you just imagine? More than 25% of the total amount is being used for the crude oil and natural gas. We could have used it for other things, maybe for technology transfer. But the only reason is that we are critically dependent upon these sources. Also, one point is very important. See, please understand. Let's say that right now we are basically importing a particular amount of crude oil. We are importing certain numbers of barrels. Now, let's say the amount of that particular crude oil increases. Once we'll have the amount increasing, definitely we'll have to spend more of dollars. Because if you have to buy these barrels, you'll have to give the money in terms of dollars. The currency used is dollars. So once we'll be spending more of dollars, what would happen is we would need more of dollars in the market, and that would automatically depreciate the value of rupee. And once the value of rupee would depreciate, what would happen is that the price of the imports would become costly. And here we are not just talking about the imports of the crude oil and natural gas. In fact, the other commodities also, the fertilizers, the electronics or the other supplies, they would also become costly. So what we're talking about is the aspect of imported inflation. That is what you have to understand, right? Now, what are the strategic concerns in front of India? The very first is West Asia dependence. initially, just before few years, we were dependent on the Gulf countries almost to the tune of 60%. Now we have reduced it to 45%. But please understand, 45% is also a big amount. And this particular region, it is prone to conflicts. So anything happening in this particular region, what we saw between Israel and Iran, the prices of the oil, they were suddenly rising. And that was also obviously a strategic concern for India, right? So that is what you have to understand. Any stability in this particular region has immediate impact with respect to the supply chains. And therefore, not just the price of the oil in India increase, but also it has a negative effect on the overall economy in different sectors, right? Be it the manufacturing, be it the other sectors, right? Also, what we have to understand is that we are now dependent upon the Russia with respect to the supply of these crude oil. But what we recently witnessed, many of the commentators, many of the big political positions holders in US, what they're saying, that it is India's money which is fueling the war with respect to Russia, Ukraine. So what they're alleging is, there are many allegations that India is funding the war because we have increased the supplies of the crude oil from Russia. And that has basically triggered a response from the US. What President Trump has done? He has basically imposed a lot of tariffs on Indian goods, which are being imported in the US. Tariffs to the tune of almost 50%. So we were at, just before few months, we were very close partners. And see how this particular thing has strained the relations. That is what you have to understand. American actions. Then we have sea lane vulnerability. More than 80% of the crude imports, they pass through the strategic straits around the world. We have certain geopolitical important choke points. Let's talk about Strait of Hormuz. Please mention in the comments. It lies between which country? Or we have the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb. Or we have the Strait of Malacca. These are geopolitical choke points. Anything happening in this particular region. Let's talk about Strait of Malacca. China can do anything in this particular area. Or let's talk about Strait of Hormuz. What is happening? Iranian military has basically sabotaged, has stopped a lot of commercial ships from flying in this particular region when we were witnessing this particular conflict between Israel and Iran. So these are very strategic threats, right? Climate commitments. We have basically made a pledge that we will be net zero by 2070. But what you have to understand is, see, sudden transition is not really possible. We cannot have a sudden transition. See, when we talk about the energy transition, and even the author talks about that, energy transition is something which should not be looked at a particular switch, that you switch from the fossil fuels to the renewable energy. No, it's not like that. It should be treated like a pathway. That is, we slowly basically incorporate these renewable energy and we try to lessen the dependence upon these crude supplies or the crude oil or the fossil fuels. It should be a pathway, right? So for that, we need technology transfer. And we also need to balance the other priorities because India is an emerging economy. We have to basically use a lot of energy supplies. So at this particular point of time, definitely we have to focus upon the renewable energy. But at the same time, we also have to use these fossil fuels, right? That is what you have to understand. Then the industrial growth. Reliable and affordable energy is the need of the hour. We often talk about increasing the share of the manufacturing sector, coming up with a national manufacturing policy. We often say that India has had a jobless growth because we transition directly from the agriculture to the services sector. So we need a kind of a strategy which gives an impetus to the manufacturing aspect. For that, energy source is indispensable. That is affordable and reliable energy. Also, we have Make in India. How would we basically realize a vision of Make in India if we don't have reliable power supplies? So these are the strategic concerns. Next aspect is what have been the global flashpoints in energy security. See, what the author says is that in the history, we have observed 5 very important events which basically make it indispensable for India to basically have the energy sovereignty aspect in its overall policy aspect, in its overall energy policy aspect, right? So what he says is that we had the 1973 oil embargo. We had the Arab countries imposing the embargo on the oil supplies to the America and its Western allies. Now this basically halted the supplies. And ultimately what happened? The prices spiked. Because see, America was over-dependent upon the OPEC, Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries. And then they realized that yes, we need to come with strategic petroleum reserves. We need to make the supply chain more diversified. That is what they focus upon, right? Then we had the 2011 Fukushima disaster. We all know that in 2011, there was a nuclear meltdown in Japan. And this basically kind of led to a crisis of confidence in the nuclear power. But slowly what we have been witnessing is, as the pollution is rising, as the emissions are rising, we are now thinking to come up with more of these nuclear power plants, right? Next, we saw what happened in 2021, Texas freeze. There was too much of cold in Texas, one of the regions in the US, which has a lot of energy resources. And the pipelines, the gas pipelines, they froze. The wind turbines, they stopped working. So what we basically saw was that the infrastructure with respect to the energy, it collapsed. So we need to have an infrastructure which is resilient in nature, which can bear the brunt of the nature, right? Next aspect is the Russia-Ukraine war. Just before the war, the European countries were dependent upon the Russia for almost 40% of the supplies of the gas. And as the war started, Russia basically weaponized this particular thing. It stopped the supply of this particular gas to European countries. And what ultimately happened, that these European countries who call for or who basically ask for coming up with more renewable energy sources, they increase their dependence upon the coal, right? So this is something which goes against the very principles of protecting the climate, right? Next, we have the 2025 Iberian blackout. Now, Iberian is a particular region which is between Spain and Portugal. Now, see, Spain and Portugal, they started with an aggressive policy of incorporating the renewable energy in the overall energy policy framework and cutting totally upon the conventional sources of energy. Now, what happened was that there was a grid failure in the renewable energy supplies. And once there was a grid failure, they had no other option. They were completely deprived of the other energy sources, because they had completely cut on the conventional energy sources. So that is what it shows, that we cannot, adopt such a strategy which basically nullifies one aspect and completely depends upon the other, right? There has to be a balance, right? Reality of global energy transition, what the author says. He says that we might talk about the transitions happening, we might talk about the renewable energy, but the reality is that still we are dependent upon the fossil fuels. What he says, fossil fuels account for more than 80% of the global energy demand till this particular day. More than 90% of the transport is still dependent upon the fossil fuels, the hydrocarbons. What he again says is that the renewable energy, though there has been a transition, we are witnessing a transition towards the renewable energy, but still they only account for less than 10% of the total global mix. When we talk about specifically the solar and the wind, just less than 10%, right? Now, again, he says, he gives a very important aspect. He says that since we are shifting our focus on the renewable energy, we have reduced our investments in the oil and gas exploration. Now, what it has done, what it has led to. At one point of time, we have reduced the investments in the exploration part, but the demand of the oil and gas is still the same. So there is a kind of a very tight supply which we are witnessing, a very tight supply with respect to the oil and gas. And this has strategic concern for those countries, especially India, who are quite dependent upon oil and gas. That is what you have to understand. Look at this, the dependency. There has been a rising oil dependency. Now, therefore, looking at all these things, see, there's a reason why I'm emphasizing upon all these areas, because there's a 100% possibility of a question coming with respect to this aspect of energy sovereignty. So what the author says is that looking at all these factors, what really becomes important is that we incorporate the energy sovereignty in our overall energy policy framework, right? And again, what would this do? This would basically imply that we focus upon the domestic capacity, developing the domestic capacity, integrating technology, that is having a diversified technology, and also making that the existing systems, they are resilient in nature. They can bear the brunt of any uncertainty, right? Now, what he says is that there are 5 pillars which India must abide at this particular moment. He says that coal gasification and indigenous energy is the need of the hour. What the author is trying to say is that we have a lot of resource with respect to the coal. We have so much of reserves of the coal, but they are non-usable. Why? Because Indian coal has a very large amount of ash. So this makes it unviable. So what he says is that why cannot we go for gasification? Right now, with the evolving technologies, we have this particular process of gasification and carbon capture, where we can use the so much of existing resource of the coal in the country and then convert it to syngas. Syngas is a particular vital intermediate which is used for the production of synthetic chemicals, fertilizers, electricity. So he says, why not convert these large reserves of coal into syngas, right? And then methanol, hydrogen, fertilizers, utilizing the syngas to convert into these products. Next aspect what he emphasizes is that focus upon the biofuels, because it is not just basically making the energy systems more green and clean, but what it is also doing is it is also empowering the rural population, right? So he says that the ethanol blending program has already led to the cut on the imports, and it has basically transferred more than 92,000 crores to the farmers who are helping in the production of the ethanol, right? Also, we have set a target of the ethanol blending, that is E20, right? And this would definitely reduce the imports and boost the rural incomes, right? We also have this particular scheme, Satat, which is sustainable alternative towards affordable transportation, utilizing or trying to basically come up with the compressed biogas plants so that this can be used in the transportation aspect. Another aspect which he says is that this would also give us a lot of organic manure. He gives a very important point. He says that especially in the northern Indian belt, after we had the green revolution and it completely degraded the soil. As of now, the organic content in the soil in the North Indian plains is almost just 0.5%. And what he says is, through this particular scheme, the Satat scheme, we have the organic manure, which has almost 25% of organic carbon content. This can be used in these soils, and this would basically reinvigorate the quality or the content of the soil, and it would make sure that the soil basically have proper retention of the water and the fertilizers, right? So the environmental aspect is also linked. Then we have the nuclear power. What he says is that when we talk about the zero carbon baseload, see, baseload is something which is the continuous power demand which is required, and that can only be possible with a source which can provide you such a power. When we talk about solar or the wind, they are intermittent. They cannot be dependent. There is no inertia in that. But when we talk about the nuclear power, it can provide us that continuous source of energy. So therefore, there's a need for reviving or coming up with more of these nuclear power plants, right? And again, we should go with a particular roadmap. See, we already know that we have huge reserves, one of the largest reserves of thorium in the country. When we talk about the monazite sand in Kerala. So what we are trying to focus upon is that why not utilize or why not basically come up with more technologies so that we can use thorium in India's third stage of nuclear power program. So that is what he is trying to basically talk about. Expand the uranium ties, especially with respect to the Central Asian countries, for example, Kazakhstan, which can provide secure supplies of uranium to India. Then we have developing the small modular reactors, very, very important. Even in this year budget, the finance minister talked about investing in constructing these small modular reactors which are compact, which are efficient, right? Then we have green hydrogen. We all know that we have the green hydrogen mission, and we are basically having a target of coming up with 5 million metric ton capacity by the year 2030. But what is needed is, for this, in order to realize this particular objective, we need to invest heavily in some of the core components of the green hydrogen supply chain. What are these? The very first is the local electrolyzer production. Very, very important. We need these electrolyzers for the production of the green hydrogen, catalyst, which is used in the particular reaction, and the storage technology. You must be aware of this particular battery storage systems, where China has basically acquired the mastery. China has the capacity. Why can't we also develop the technology with respect to the storage of the green hydrogen, right? Finally, he talks about the pumped hydro storage. Very, very important. What he says is that when we talk about the solar or the wind, these energy systems don't have the inertia with them. But when we talk about the hydro power systems, the reservoirs, they have the inertia. Whenever we have, let's say there's a power outage and some power sources fail, for example, solar or the wind, then we can have these hydropower projects as a reliable source, as a durable source. Also considering the topography of India, we should construct more of these reservoirs, which can be helpful in the times of crisis and the times of need, provides balancing and inertia for renewable heavy grids. India's geography, it has a potential for large-scale hydro storage. China has been doing it, especially when we talk about the Yarlung Zampo, what we call as Brahmaputra in India. It has been constructing massive dams. For example, one of the largest dams is coming in the Medak County of Tibet, being constructed by China. So we can also do that. See, again, understand, the overall objective is to transition from the energy security to a more broad aspect of energy sovereignty, which basically talks about more reliant, self-reliant systems, more resilient systems, not just the availability and the affordability aspect. Because looking at the picture we are having with respect to the geopolitical churn which is taking place, the conflicts which are taking place, it is really important that we develop our own sources and we also develop more resilient supply chains. That is what the objective is all about. Let's have a mains practice question, very important. India's growing dependence on the imported crude oil and natural gas poses serious risks to the economic stability and strategic sovereignty. In this context, critically examine the challenges of over-reliance on single source imports and discuss the role of energy sovereignty through coal gasification, biofuels, nuclear power, green hydrogen, and pumped hydro in strengthening the India's energy security. 15 marks, 250 words. Please do write a particular answer to this question. Very important topic. There can be a probable question next year in the mains, right? So do write. And yes, if you're liking the initiative, do not forget to press the like button and also let us know in the comment section. Let's go to the next topic. Coming to the next topic, this is with respect to why India needs more women in the STEM domain. Now we have this particular column from the Hindu. It says that there is a program which is the BioCare program by the Ministry of Science and Technology. The very objective of BioCare program is to provide a particular grant and a regular salary to selected numbers of women researchers and scientists in the country. So in the month of March, the Department of Biotechnology, it basically chose 75 women scientists in the country. But till this day, they have not received the grant. Now, the grant is primarily for the extramural research. That is a kind of an independent research outside the institution. And they have still not received the regular salary component. Now, this tells us about the state of affairs with respect to the women scientists in the country. See, what we are witnessing is the integration of technology in almost every domain. You talk about e-commerce, you talk about transportation, you talk about space exploration. So, what is really needed is an adequate participation of women in this particular domain, so as to also make the field more competitive, right? So as of now, the number of women in the STEM domain is relatively less. Building a technically strong and competitive women workforce in the STEM is the need of the hour. Very, very important topic, especially from the perspective of GS1, role of women, social empowerment, and GS2, issues relating to the social sector. Now, let's first talk about this particular acronym, which is the STEM. What does STEM stands for? See, it was a particular report of National Science Foundation of the US in 2001, which for the very first time coined this particular acronym, which is STEM. Now, this basically talks about a particular curriculum system which focuses upon 4 different domains. We have the science, we have technology, we have engineering, and we have mathematics. So, it is a kind of a mix of these 4 domains, the STEM domain, right? Now, when we talk about position of India in the STEM, what you have to understand is that for years, even before the independence, India has been one of the most important sources for the people working in the STEM domain, not just in the country itself, but also the researchers working in different countries around the world. So India has a very important position with respect to providing people working in the STEM domain, right? Both domestically as well as internationally. Then we also have Article 51A, which talks about incorporating or which talks about inculcating the spirit of inquiry among the people, fostering scientific temper in the minds of the people. So again, it is very, very important. Now, what is the importance of STEM domain as of now? We are currently witnessing the Industrial Revolution 4.0, where we are witnessing the evolution of different technologies. The most important being the artificial intelligence. We have machine learning, we have cloud computing, we have robotics, we have blockchain. Now, since, see, all these technologies have in a one way or the other, they have become a part of the life. Now, therefore, we need more people to work in these domains so as to come up with more disruptive solutions. More solutions which can also look into the socio-economic aspect. Focus upon improving the lives of the people. So that is really very important. Also, we have a lot of challenges. When we talk about challenges, for example, let's say the climate change. Now, when we talk about the adaptation and mitigation with respect to climate change, we need technology. And in order to come up with more efficient and cost-effective technologies, we need more of people working in this particular domain. And not just climate change. Let's talk about the non-conventional challenges. For example, let's say we have organized crimes, we have cybersecurity challenges. So in these particular domain, it is really important that we have more of people so that there is a spirit of competitive environment in the domain, and we have people coming up with more frugal innovations, more cost effective products, right? Also, the National Science Foundation report says, the report is of 2021, it says that in the next decade, more than 80% of the jobs, in one way or the other, they would require some component of science and mathematics with respect to the skill required in that particular job. So it is very, very important that we focus upon the skill acquisition, especially with respect to the women in the STEM domain, right? Now, when we talk about women in the STEM, according to the Global Gender Gap Report, it says that the women are underrepresented in the STEM, and the workforce participation in the STEM domain stands at 28.2%. Now, the workforce participation is 28.2% with respect to STEM domain. However, when we talk about the non-STEM domain, the workforce participation is almost 47%. What it shows that women are participating more in the non-STEM domain and less in the STEM domain, right? So this is a point of concern. We have almost 43% of the STEM graduates in India who are women. A very good point. But there is a concern. Though we have good participation with respect to the women in the education, but when we talk about the jobs, it's almost 20%. So we are not able to convert that participation in the education with respect to the workforce. Maybe we are not giving them the adequate skills, or they're not properly trained. So that is one of the very important strategic challenges. Also, there is a 81% gap with respect to the funding when we talk about the research and development. Here we are talking about the gender gap. There's a gender gap with respect to the research and development. What the article is talking about, that more than 4 to 5 months have elapsed and still these researchers have not received the funding. This tells us about the sad state of affairs. You can also look at this. We have 43% of the total STEM enrollments of women and 57% are men. But when you see a higher education profile, right? Let's say we have the PhD, or let's say we have other postdoctoral research, the share of women continuously reduces. Now, what are the causes of low participation of women in the STEM domain? The very first is social conditioning. Very, very important. See, what is conditioning actually? The kind of environment we are brought up in, that to a large extent shapes our mindset. In a country like India, we have certain unconscious biases which exist in the human minds, and that shape our personality. In India, it is generally believed that men are better suited for these STEM domain. Women should focus upon the weak science. For example, they call it weak science in terms of biology or these domains or humanities. Right? Next, we have the negative gender stereotypes. As I told you, there are entrenched notions of patriarchy. There are parochial visions in the society. And that to a large extent basically stop or hinder the participation of women in the STEM domain. Next, we have social bias in certain STEM domains. In this particular article itself, we have the Department of Biotechnology, which should have transferred the funds by now, but it didn't transfer. What does it show? That there are certain people in the domain itself who have these biases, preconceived notions, right? Because by now the fund should have been transferred. Next, we have lack of support during the transitioning to higher roles. Very, very important. See, let's say you have a particular woman pursuing her PhD or pursuing her postdoctoral research. Now, this is a period in her life when she is also having some other responsibilities, some other very important family responsibilities, be it the childbearing. Now, the kind of construct, the mental construct which society has is that the woman should focus more upon her family, not her work. So in most of the cases, what happens is that women has to basically choose one of these, and she primarily chooses her family. So she has to lose the research, right? She has to leave the research. Then we have retention challenge. There are a lot of challenges within the STEM domain itself. See, the kind of work which is there in the STEM domain, it's primarily based upon the research in the labs. There are no fixed hours, right? And again, see, most of these women, they are engaged in the lab roles. The roles which require interaction, they are given to the male counterparts. So there are retention challenges also. Also, we have the pay gaps. There's almost a pay gap of 35% when we talk about the pay gap in the STEM domain itself. So that is a cause of concern. Now, what have been the government initiatives to enhance women participation in these STEM? The very first is Vigyan Jyoti scheme. Now, this is a particular initiative of Department of Science and Technology. The very objective of this particular scheme is to nurture the girl child students from class 9th to 12th in order to enhance their participation in the STEM domain. Then we have the knowledge involvement through research, advancement and nurturing, again a scheme of Department of Science and Technology. It has a particular sub-scheme which is Women in Science and Engineering. The very objective of both these schemes is to basically incorporate more of women in the science domain. Next, we have the Gati scheme. The very objective of this particular scheme is to enhance the participation of the women in the higher learning, right? Then we have the Curie scheme, which stands for the Consolidating the University Research for Innovation and Excellence. Again, a scheme of Department of Science and Technology, right? Then we have the SERPAR, Science Engineering Research Board. Again, the very objective is to enhance the participation of women in the science domain. Then we have the BioCare. We already talked about this particular scheme. The article is all about that. And then we have different fellowships. For example, the Indo-US Fellowship, which give specific grants to certain women, right, in order to basically excel so that they can work upon a particular domain and then excel in their particular research. Now, what should be the way forward? The very first is need to break the gendered notion of intelligence. Very, very important. We cannot have this irrational notion that boys are more intelligent when we talk about the maths domain or girls are more intelligent when we talk about the biology domain. No, they're totally absurd. The decision with respect to pursuing a particular domain should be based upon the children's aspiration, what his or her choice is all about, right? So again, we have to basically go with that. Then incentivizing the institutions. Different institutions, be it the educational institutions, be it the research institutions, they need to provide certain basic minimum incentives. As I already told you that this is a particular period in a woman's life where she also has her family obligations. So in the form of the maternity benefit or in the form of creche facilities or flexible working hours, these can be provided to the women, right? Then we have supportive provisions at the workplace. Again, there have been cases of harassments. So there has to be stringent provisions. Security installations must be there because the research requires a lot of intensive, rigorous work, right? So that has to be there. Then we have the role models. Again, very important. You must have heard about Tessie Thomas, known as the missile women of the country. Or we had Kalpana Chawla, right? We have Sunita Williams. So why not incorporate these people in the overall discussions? They can act as the role model for the women. They can basically influence the people at large. Make sure that people, just get rid of these entrenched notions of patriarchy and make sure that women participate in large numbers in the STEM domain. We also have these, way forwards, which must be there. Enhanced scientific temperament. Holistic approach must be taken, starting from the very school days. Hands-on experiences with respect to the technology. We understand that when we talk about the digital literacy, women are more digitally illiterate than men in the country. Why? Because they are not being provided with the adequate provisions, digital provisions, be it the internet or be it the smartphones. That has to be done. Engaging in different activities, interactive self-learning, retained interest, very, very important. So that has to be there, right? Let's have a mains practice question. Women participation in STEM in India suffers from various factors despite many initiatives by the government. Discuss 10 marks, 150 words. Do write a particular answer on this question. Coming to the simplified section, we have the first topic which talks about India's China challenge. Now the gist of the article is what the author is trying to say. He's saying that US has imposed a lot of tariffs on India's exports to the US. And that has definitely affected India's economy. Now, as a result, what India is trying to do is India is trying to align or realign its strategic positions. And it is getting closer to China. Recently, we also saw that we had the Chinese foreign minister coming to India, inviting Prime Minister Modi with respect to the SCO summit, right? Extending the personal invitation of Xi Jinping. But according to the author, what he's trying to say is that America is basically asking India to open its market. See, the reason why America has imposed the tariffs, first, it is primarily that what America thinks is that India is following a protectionist regime. It is not allowing the American products to come into its market. Second is obviously the Russian imports with respect to the crude oil in India, right? So what America wants that India should not import these crude oils because it is in a way funding the war, the Russia-Ukraine war. What the author is trying to say is that China's capacity, and pay attention, is very, very important. China's capacity to overwhelm the India's market It is more than that of the US. So we should not be too close to China. And what is the reason? That there are stark differences between the capacity of India and China, especially when we talk about the manufacturing aspect, or when we talk about the share in the overall global trade, the share of China, whereas vis-a-vis compared to that of India, right? So these are very important points. That is what the author is trying to talk about. Prime Minister Narendra Modi said to meet Chinese President Xi Jinping in Tianjin on the sidelines of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Leaders Summit, right? Shadow of Donald Trump. India has always been very, right, cautious of Chinese exports flooding the Indian market. This is why New Delhi pulled out of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, one of the largest trade partnerships around the world. India did not join the RCEP, though India was a part of the negotiations, but finally it decided that it's not going to join the RCEP, primarily because it had this particular concern that if India joins RCEP, India's market would be flooded with the cheap Chinese supplies and its domestic industries would be at stake, right? But again, nothing has changed the picture. We still see the domination of the Chinese products in the Indian market, right? So that is what we have to understand. A China-led free trade agreement among the 15 Asia-Pacific countries and 19. After the Galwan clashes, there were calls to stop the trade with China. But did we basically realize that? See, we cannot do that because we are dependent upon China for very, very important needs, be it the APIs, active pharmaceutical ingredients, or the critical minerals, or the heavy electrical and construction machineries, from where you will source these inputs. So therefore, we are critically dependent, right? The Indian government banned several Chinese apps and restricted the foreign direct investment. But still, you must understand that China has been one of the leading investors in one of the very important startups in the country, be it Zomato, be it Baiju's, right? So China has been constantly investing, right, in these startups. This is why the recent U-turn is significant. It is almost entirely driven by the US President Donald Trump's decision to impose reciprocal tariffs on countries world over. Now, this is important. Along with Brazil, India at 50% is right now the most tariffed country by the US. China faced 145% tariffs one point of time, but they were rolled back to 30%. Why do you think so? Because US cannot afford that. US is also critically dependent upon Chinese imports, right? So here we see that strategic aspect. Though China is more closer to Russia, right? But still, US is not imposing that much amount of tariffs, which it has basically imposed on India, right? Primarily because of strategic calculus. The looming threat of tariffs and Trump's unpredictability has sent countries around the world looking for alternative trade relations. And that is the reason India is looking for different partners. A week ago, the Chinese ambassador to India said that the US has imposed tariffs up to 50% on India and even threatened for more. China firmly opposed it. Silence only emboldens the bully. So that is what Chinese ambassador has said indirectly to India. For some, overtures from China may appear welcome at the time when the US seems determined to force India to open its market for American goods. But there are certain reasons, several reasons, why closer trade partnership with China is fraught with challenges. More serious challenges than with respect to the US. The very first is India's trade weakness. India's trade relations with China are in contrast to its trade stint with the US. Against the US, India enjoys an annual trade surplus of more than $40 billion. There's a trade surplus with respect to India-US trade for India. By contrast, India suffers an annual trade deficit to the tune of almost $100 billion with respect to China. Can you imagine? $100 billion trade deficit with respect to China. Chart 1 shows India's steeply rising dependence on imports from China since 2014, when Prime Minister Modi took over, when he started calling for a more self-reliant India. And see how things have changed. When we talk about the imports from China continuously increasing, right? So that is what you have to understand. China's strength in manufacturing. India is not only the country that has a trade deficit with China, right? Most of the countries, in fact, they have a trade deficit with China. China's share of the merchandise exports in the world at more than 14% in 23. More than 14% of the overall merchandise trade share is with China. Is well above that of the US, which is around 8%. And India's share is just 2%. Can you just look at this particular chart, right? So China versus world production. Top 10 minus China countries, the total producers, they combined, that is almost the value of China. So that is the kind of prowess which China has. Chart 2 shows that as of 2020, China's manufacturing output was more than the next 10 countries combined. You have 11 countries lined up, the first being China. You add these countries, leaving China. So that is the kind of production which China has. It equates that of these 10 countries together, right? Chart 3 and 4 show how China's share in the global manufacturing compares with countries such as US and India. Look at this. China's share, world's biggest manufacturing economies. China is almost at 35%, US is 12%. Look at the value added. China at 29%, US at 16%. And look at India. India is almost at 3%. And over here, we have India again at 3%. So India is having a very minuscule share in comparison to that of China. India's weakness in manufacturing, the table shows the gross value added in the manufacturing since 2019-20 has grown at a compound annual growth rate of 4%, while in agriculture it has grown by 4.7. So the rates are not too high, right? There's a kind of a stagnant growth which we are witnessing. Since trade is a relative game and it is a consequence that at a time when China is overflowing with manufacturing powers and capacity, India's manufacturing is struggling to outpace even its farm output. So that is what you have to understand. That right now we are struggling with the manufacturing aspect. Whereas on the other hand, China has a kind of expertise with respect to being the center or the assembly line of the world. Be it the electronics, be it the rare earth metals, be it the electronic equipment. So that is what we have to see. How to be an alternative. In the aftermath of the COVID pandemic, India presented itself to the world as a credible investment alternative to China. We said that China is something which is not trustworthy. You come and invest in India. Aligning with China may severely compromise its claim to be an investment destination for the Western businesses. So when after the COVID pandemic, we said that India is a better destination. Now you are again aligning to China. That would not give a good impression to these investors around the world, right? Who want to de-risk from China. Just as the US is likely pressuring the trade allies to raise trade barriers against China, it may pursue a similar line of attack with India if New Delhi is seen to be getting closer to China than the US. See, what US is doing is, for those countries trading with China, US is asking those countries that raise your trade barriers. So if India also, gets closer to China, US might ask those countries who are trading with India to basically raise their barriers with respect to the trading with India, right? That is what is possible. China's overcapacity, India's problem. China is already battling deflation, which is more dangerous than that of the inflation, as it robs the consumers of the incentive to buy and producers of the incentive to produce. Deflation can bring an economy to its knees. The way out for China is to flood markets other than the US and now perhaps of the US allies with its excess capacity. If India stands too close to China, pressures to absorb the cheaper Chinese goods may basically increase. China can use it as a strategic tool. See, if you want to secure the supplies of strategic minerals or rare earth element, open your economy. Let me dump more of my products in your country, right? So that is very possible. China is not India's natural partner. India has been trying to mold itself into a private sector-led market economy where media is free. We are a democracy, right? And we have our own set of rules. We have a rule of law, but that is not the case in China, right? Rules are transparent and democracy is uncompromised. While China, it is still unclear where the private sector ends and the state begins. We often say that in China, there is state-led capitalism. It is the state which decides each and everything, right? China is a long-time supporter of Pakistan and its all-weather friend, right? It has been also alleged, and in fact, it's true that China basically supplied the nuclear technology to Pakistan, which basically helped it to become a nuclear power, right? Given the challenge of Pakistani state-sponsored terrorism directed against India, building a stable and credible relationship with China may be easier said than done. The upshot, India is continuing to be shy about opening itself with a free global trade, is essentially a result of deep structural weaknesses. See, we cannot again and again give the same reason that our farmers need protection, our domestic industry needs protection. Someday or the other, we'll have to open the markets, right? So we'll have to make our own domestic industries more competitive, right? Give them adequate credit. Try to transfer the adequate technology in order to make sure that our products are as competitive as the products which are coming from China, right? This means that strategic conflicts aside, China's capability to overwhelm the Indian economy is far more than that of US. Very, very important line. As New Delhi has to proceed with caution when it comes to dealing with its giant neighbor. So we need to have a caution in the approach. We cannot be overly dependent. And see, definitely India has been doing so, right? Because we have charted the choppy waters of international politics, right? And in a very efficient manner. So definitely India is trying its best, but it has to be more cautious as what the author is saying. Let's go to the next topic. Coming to the next topic, this is a particular news coming from the bureaucratic corridors, which says that the government appoints the former Reserve Bank of India Governor Urjit Patel as the International Monetary Fund Executive Director. The government has approved the appointment of former Reserve Bank of India Governor Urjit Patel as Executive Director at the International Monetary Fund for a period of 3 years. He will replace KV Subramania, whose services terminated by the government 6 months ahead of his tenure. Now, this is important. That is how you extract the information for the prelims. The IMF's executive board is composed of 25 directors elected by member countries or groups of countries. India is a part of 4-country constituency along with Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Bhutan. So we have a 4-country constituency which comprises of India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka and Bhutan. Let's talk about the IMF. Very, very important. The IMF was conceived in July 1944 at the United Nations Bretton Woods Conference. The 44 countries in attendance sought to build a framework for international economic cooperation and avoid repeating the competitive currency devaluations that contributed to the Great Depressions of 1930s. What kind of financial assistance does the IMF offer? Important. Unlike the development banks, see, we have the development banks, for example, we have the World Bank giving a kind of grants or loans with very small interest. IMF basically does not lend for specific projects. Instead, the IMF provides the financial support to countries hit by crisis, what generally we refer to as balance of payment crisis, to create breathing room as they implement policies that restore the economic stability and growth. It also provides precautionary financing to help prevent crisis. IMF's lending is continuously refined to meet the country's changing needs. And whenever IMF lends money to a particular country, it also in most of the cases, it comes with certain conditionalities. For example, we call as the structural adjustment program. It may ask a country to open its market, right, to reduce the subsidies. That is a kind of structural adjustment program. The IMF works to achieve sustainable growth and prosperity for all its 191 member countries. It does so by supporting the economic policies that promote financial stability and monetary cooperation, which are essential to increase the productivity, job creation. The objective remains the same, right? The IMF is governed by and accountable to its member countries. The IMF has 3 critical missions: furthering the international monetary cooperation, encouraging the expansion of the trade and economic growth, and discouraging policies that would harm the prosperity. That is what you have to understand. Now, who runs the IMF? This is a kind of functioning through which the IMF is governed. The IMF is accountable to its member country governments. At the top of the organization is the Board of Governors, consisting of 1 governor and 1 alternate governor from each member country, usually the top officials of the central bank or the finance ministry. Right? So we have the finance minister in India and the Reserve Bank of India governor, right? The Board of Governors meets once a year at the IMF World Bank annual meetings. 25 of the governors serve on the International Monetary Financial Committee or the IMFC, which advises the IMF's executive board. The day-to-day work of the IMF is overseen by a 25-member executive board, which represents the entire membership and is supported by the IMF staff. So we have for this particular constituency of 4 countries, India, Bangladesh, Bhutan and Sri Lanka. We have Urjit Patel as one of the 25-member executive directors. The managing director is the head of the IMF staff and the chair of the executive board and is assisted by 4 deputy managing directors. That is what you have to understand. Now, we also have certain very important publications. World Economic Outlook is published by the IMF. Then we have Global Financial Stability Report. Then we have Fiscal Monitor. All 3 published by the International Monetary Fund. Now, also look at this particular thing. The World Bank publishes several important reports focusing upon various aspects of global development. Key reports are World Development Report, Global Economic Prospects, Poverty and Shared Prosperity series. So this is very, very important because, again, there have been questions which have come in the UPSC with respect to the reports. Who publishes these reports? Please pay attention. Let's go to the next topic. Coming to the next topic, this is with respect to a particular statement made by the Lok Sabha Speaker with respect to the functioning of the parliamentary committees or the discussions which take place in various parliamentary panels. Lok Sabha Speaker Om Birla on Friday expressed a concern over the lack of meaningful discussions in the Lok Sabha, Rajya Sabha and state legislative assemblies. In parliamentary committees, the language, thoughts and viewpoints of the members are always above party politics. So here he has given importance of the discussions with respect to which take place in the parliamentary committees. Now, see, whenever we talk about parliamentary committees, what is the rationale? What is the very objective? See, Parliament as a body, as a supreme law-making institution, it has a lot of tasks to do, right? So, many of the tasks with respect to the research or analyzing a particular bill, scrutiny of the government's action, it is better done by these committees. That's the first thing, to reduce the workload with respect to the Parliament. Second is, when we talk about to provide the expert opinion. These parliamentary committees, they're composed of those people who have had experience in various domains, right? So they provide the expert advice. Third is primarily to secure the accountability with respect to the executive, right? To scrutinize their actions. That is very, very important. So whenever we talk about the classification of parliamentary committees, they can be classified as standing or they can be classified as ad hoc committees. When we talk about the standing, they are more of the committees which have a permanent nature. They are basically elected for a particular period of time, right? Or the members are nominated for a particular period of time. Whereas the ad hoc committees, they are for a specific purpose. We'll talk about that. When we talk about the standing committees, very important are the financial standing committees. For example, we have the Public Accounts Committee, Estimates Committee, Public Undertaking Committee. When we talk about the Public Accounts Committee, it comprises of 22 members, right? And we have 15 members from the Lok Sabha, 7 from the Rajya Sabha, chosen by proportional representation by means of single transferable vote. And generally, by convention, you have the chairman of the Public Accounts Committee who is from the opposition, by convention, always remember. Then we have the Estimates Committee, comprises of 30 members, all from Lok Sabha, elected by proportional representation by means of single transferable vote, right? Then we have Public Undertakings Committee, again 22 members, 15 from Lok Sabha, 7 from Rajya Sabha, the same method, proportional representation by means of single transferable vote. What is the very objective of the Public Accounts Committee and Public Undertakings Committee? To look at the reports of the Comptroller and Auditor General, to basically go through them and then come with its own findings. That is what you have to understand. Then we also have the department-related standing committees. See, we have various ministries and departments. Now, all the ministries and departments, they have a particular standing committee, right, which looks into their particular domain. Let's say you have Ministry of Agriculture, so we'll have a department-related standing committee for Ministry of Agriculture, right? Now, every DRSC, it has 31 members. Very, very important. 21 coming from the Lok Sabha and the rest 10 coming from the Rajya Sabha. Now, the members are nominated, not elected. That is what you have to understand. In total, we have 24 DRSCs, 16 under the overall supervision of the Lok Sabha and 8 under the overall supervision of Rajya Sabha. That is what you have to understand. Then we have ad hoc committees for a specific purpose. Either it can be inquiry committee or it can be advisory committee. Advisory with respect to giving advice on a particular matter. Either it can be a select committee, that is from a particular house, or it can be a joint committee. Members from both the house. For example, we had recently the Waqf joint parliamentary committee on the Waqf bill, right? Next, we can have again the inquiry committee to inquire into a particular matter. Let's say a particular scam has taken place. So as to inquire within that particular time frame. After their task is done, they are then disbanded. That is the whole structure of the parliamentary committees in India. I hope it is clear, right? Let's go to the next topic. Coming to the next topic, here's the news coming with respect to the appointment of judges to the Supreme Court. So we have the appointment of 2 new judges to the Supreme Court, and now the Supreme Court will function to its full sanction strength, right? Chief Justice of India, B.R. Gavai on Friday swore in Justice Alok Aradhe and Vipulam Pancholi as judges of the Supreme Court. With their appointment, the court returned to its full sanction strength of 34 judges. So the full sanction strength as of now of the Supreme Court is 34 judges. Now, this is again a very important news, especially in the context of Justice Vipulam Pancholi. Why? I'll tell you. Justice Pancholi is in line to become the Chief Justice of India under the seniority norm from October 3, 2031. So this is important. He is set to become the Chief Justice, and a very interesting point is that there was a kind of a dissent note given by Justice B.V. Nagaratna with respect to the collegium, right? So she gave her dissent note with respect to the appointment of Justice Pancholi, that he should not be basically appointed, right? But still there was a majority, 4:1, and ultimately we saw the appointment. The collegium, by a 4:1 majority, recommended Justice Pancholi and Aradhe on August 25. Their appointment to the top court was notified within 48 hours on August 27. Now, this is very, very important. Collegium system, as I just said, so it is a 5-membered body, and there was a dissent note given by Justice B.V. Nagaratna, right? Collegium system for the judicial appointments. Judges of the higher judiciary are appointed through the collegium system. Is the word collegium mentioned in the Constitution? The answer is complete no. The collegium, consisting of the Chief Justice of India and the 4 senior-most judges of the Supreme Court, decides on the appointments, elevations, and transfer. So it is a 5-membered body, Chief Justice and 4 senior-most judges. The term collegium is not mentioned in the Indian Constitution but has been established through judicial pronouncement. Through various judges' cases, we have this particular construct of collegium which has evolved. Evolution of the collegium system. First judges' case. Now this is very important because this year itself, in the mains 2025, we had a question with respect to the evolution of collegium system, right? So that is why it becomes very important. First judges' case of 1981. What it said was that when we talk about the primacy of the CGI's recommendation, that is not absolute. For cogent reason, the executive can basically refuse the recommendations given by the Chief Justice of India. That was basically said in the first judge's case. So it gave a kind of a strategic advantage to the executive, right? Primacy to the executive. Second judge's case, the Supreme Court introduced the collegium system. So it was primarily in the second judge's case where this concept of collegium came into being, where it was said that the word consultation, when we say that the president has to consult the Supreme Court, right, the Chief Justice, it basically means that consultation means concurrence. He'll have to agree by what has been said by the Chief Justice of India. And this is not just CGI's own individual opinion. It has to be based with respect to the two senior most judges. So initially in the second judge's case, the collegium came into being and it was basically made a 3-membered body. Then later in the third judge's case, the Supreme Court, with respect to the precedent's reference, expanded the collegium to a 5-membered body, from a 3-membered body to a 5-membered body. In the fourth judge's case, we already saw that the 99th Constitutional Amendment Act, with respect to the National Judicial Appointments Commission, it was struck on the premise that it basically violated the independence of the judiciary, right? And we have still the collegium system on the basis of which the whole system works. So that is what you have to understand, right? Let's go to the last topic of the day. Coming to the last topic of today's discussion, this is with respect to Daruma Doll, a very important component of art and culture, and a probable question in the prelims can definitely be there. On the inaugural day of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to Japan, Reverend Seishi Hirose, chief priest of the Daruma-ji temple, presented him with the Daruma Doll, an iconic cultural symbol of Japan, right? So do pay attention, very important. The doll, Daruma, is a traditional Japanese wish doll, typically made of paper mesh. The doll is considered a symbol of perseverance and good luck. That is how you extract the information for the prelims. Its size can range from few inches to several feet. Often, the doll features a word luck written in kanji, the logographic writing system used in Japan. Traditionally, people color one eye of the doll after setting a personal goal. If they achieve this goal, the other eye is also colored. The practice symbolizes the virtue of determination, right? The doll's distinctive round bottom allows it to remain upright even if tipped over, reflecting the saying, fall 7 times, stand up 8. So that is what it is written in the column, that once you buy it, there are no eyes. So once you make a wish, draw one of the Daruma's blank eyes as wishing. Once your wish, it gets completed, once it becomes true, then if your wish has come true, then the other black eye is then drawn, right? So it completes the eye. The Indian correction, the Daruma is modeled after the Bodhidharma, the 5th century founder of Zen Buddhism. Use this information for the prelims. The Indian monk hailed from Kanchipuram in Tamil Nadu and is known in Japan as Daruma Daishi. So he is known in Japan as Daruma Daishi, Bodhidharma. Bodhidharma meditated for 9 years, continuously facing a wall with his limbs folded. This belief explains Daruma Doll's peculiar rounded shape with no limbs and eyes. Bodhidharma is said to have meditated in a cave in China's Henan province. The word Daruma is derived from the Sanskrit word dharma, right, which has no equivalent in Japanese or Chinese. So it's almost a similar form of dharma. The temple, the Shorinzen Darumaji temple in Takasaki, was built in 1697, is considered Daruma's place of origin. Takasaki is also one of the largest producers of Daruma dolls. Locals frequent it before exams or important business meeting, so as to have good luck, right? So that is a very objective. So that's it for today. I hope you really enjoyed the discussion. If you did, please do mention in the comments. All the very best. Thank you so much.